The Race to World First is undoubtedly WoW's largest event with every coming raid tier. It grabs the attention of all players of all skill levels across the globe to see the top players of Warcraft do what they do best. It wasn't until BFA that these races actually started to be streamed to the world for even non-WoW players to begin invested into, but the race has been a thing since a WoW release, always waiting to see who could be the very best for the eternal boastfulness. In this list, we're going to be going over some of the top Race to World First moments to date. And starting us off at number 10, we have the Emerald Nightmare. Upon the release of Legion, Blizzard opted to follow their tradition of pretty minimal first rate tiers. It wasn't designed to be anything over the top, and not the major highlight of the expansion as a whole until the release of the Nighthold raid later on in the Legion cycle. With Legion came the infamous artifact weapons for players to wield and upgrade over time. You also had the inclusion of Legion Legendaries, which would also drop at complete random from any source of content found in Legion. Similar to the artifact weapons, these legendaries greatly increase your character's throughput and often entirely change how a class was played. You could have up to 2 of these legendaries equipped per character, but their method of obtaining them was rather slow at the time. Originally, what happened was your character had a base amount of luck to get a legendary at random that would slowly increase with each activity you completed, such as completing a Mythic Plus dungeon. It would continue to infinitely increase until the game finally rewarded you with a random legendary according to your class and specialization. Because of the pretty high randomness and a large grind to get the legendary you may have specifically wanted, Blizzard assumed players would only have 1 legendary equipped by the time the Emerald Nightmare raid came around. However, in an unexpected turn, the Race to World First players instead opted to have almost their entire account filled with a single class. What they would do is essentially level their Warlock to max, for example, and begin grinding for legendaries. They would play to unhealthy degrees to obtain the first few legendaries for their character, and if they did not get the ones they wanted, they would instead start completely over on another character, as it was actually faster than to continue the grind on their main. So the players would just repeatedly level their ults and keep grinding until they got lucky enough for the most optimal DPS increase. With this schedule Blizzard had given these players, it proved successful. As when Emerald Nightmare was eventually released on Mythic for All, and rather than a week or so event like players had started to become accustomed to, the entire raid was cleared in 18 hours by the Guild X sources. Because Blizzard had failed to consider the degenerate levels of gameplay these players would attempt, their tuning for the raid fell completely short. And when the players zoned in, they absolutely stomped every single boss in their path. It actually is the shortest race in WoW's entire history if you don't include the single boss raids like the Ruby Sanctum, and has set a new precedent to how Blizzard actually tackles and tunes their raids now for the experience of all players. It was just a glorious fumble on Blizzard's end, as they completely misinterpreted the dedication the top-end players actually have, and the Emerald Nightmare raid was soon heralded as one of the worst Mythic raids to come from WoW, setting a pretty terrible tone for what was to come from Legion as a whole. Luckily, Blizzard learned a great deal from this event and has taken more of a liking to making the raids too hard and nerfing them down slowly in accordance with the player power that they're seeing amongst the World First players, which we'll see in a future entry. This moment really nails into the coffin how Mythic raids are approached nowadays, and is not looked upon very fondly for the non-challenging experience, but rather the history it has. For our 9th entry, you have the Young Dip hitting that skip. To fans of Liquid or even fans of Echo, this entry makes a complete 180 turn compared to the last entry, and you'd mostly be correct. In one of the more recent races of World First, specifically during Yggdrasil, the Dream's Hope, fans would bear witness to the events of Young Dip. During the progression of Smolderon and Mythic, fans would begin to witness the first legitimate wall of the raid and a boss that truly separates the more casual type players from the higher end due to his menacing mechanics and very high DPS check. Essentially what happened is someone on the Liquid raiding team dropped the experimental Anima Cell toy down in between their pulls. Using this toy will spawn a large Anima power looking orb similar to Torghast's Zone. Clicking on the orb will then offer players a couple of randomized choices that generally just add some comedic flair to your character. One of these options, however, is the option to transform your character into a child of the race you're currently playing. In the case of a Demon Hunter on Horde, it would be a Blood Elf child, as no other race on Horde can play Demon Hunters. For the player Young Dip, this exact thing would occur, and a strange animation of the Blood Elf child model upon backpedaling with him, causing the character to skip backwards. Now at this point, Liquid had already sunk many hours into the progression on Smolderon and Mythic, and they'd been hitting their heads against the wall for quite some time. Like most WoW raiders, eventually it just settles to this odd atmosphere of tired players fighting almost anything enjoyable, and the spectators of Liquid all hoarded to Young Dip. Jokes all around started to ensue as Young Dip started to hit the backward skip, and the entire raid team started laughing hysterically, alongside many of the Twitch chat followers. It was just so insanely goofy and stupid that it became a running joke for the remaining entirety of the Yggdrasil race of World First, and it was almost impossible to go anywhere without hearing jokes about Young Dip if you were following the raiding scene. You could be part of other competitors' Twitch chats, Echo and Method, and see fans of Liquid just constantly spamming "Young Dip hit that skip" in the chat. It became sort of a rallying cry for Liquid in their attempts to capture the world first of Firac, and even persists as a joke now after the race is concluded. Basically, it's just a really silly joke that went viral during the mid-result race that really encompasses the sort of vibes many players start to have when progressing a difficult boss after some time. And at number 8, we have the Shaw of Fear encounter. Upon the release of Mist of Pandaria came the 3 raids, the Mogushan Vault, Heart of Fear, and the Terrace of Endless Springs. Terrans of Endless Springs was the final raid of the startup MoP, and the Shaw of Fear was the ultimate boss of its conception. The raid he was located in had only 4 bosses, but the first tier of raids was all split up into 3 different raids with very little trash and mostly just bosses. These bosses were not exceptionally difficult at the time, but were created in an era that began to define the high-end raiding we know today. In Mist of Pandaria, raids were divided into 4 categories, 10 and 25-man normal and 10 and 25-man heroic. Each mode depended on the amount of players and difficulty you had set for your team. In the case of the 25-man heroic, it was considered to be the hardest content in the game because having more players caused the raids to scale up in difficulty due to their larger health and damage. Heroic modes will also add additional mechanics that normal would typically not have, further increasing strategy and theory crafting for guilds. In the case of the Shaw of Fear, however, this boss is most notably remembered for being an insane 20-minute long boss fight on 25-man heroic, claimed by Method. No boss in existence has ever lasted that long during their kill and remained that way consistently until their next raid tier. Imagine trying to down any boss in Modern WoW or even Classic and it takes you an entire 20 minutes to do so. You'd be near the 18-minute mark or so and wipe, and then have to redo the entire process again and remember each step you took to reach the 18-minute mark to execute the boss. This event in the World First race led to a different outlook on how Blizzard approached their fights, and they'd attempt to never make a fight so lengthy ever again. It was just super unfun to fight a boss for so long and get close to victory, only to make a minor mistake and trip at the finish line. Even sub 10-minute fights like Sylvanas and Razagath, for example, are pretty unpopular due to their long fight times. A good middle ground for an end boss seems to be around the 7 to 8 minute mark for Blizzard and players alike, so the events of this 20-minute encounter have set in stone a permanent reflection of all WoW fights for the future. And at number 7, we have Yggdrasil, the Dream's Hope race. In one of the more recent mythic races to kill an end boss, the top 2 contender guilds, Echo and Liquid, saw some of the best head-to-head interactions to date. For all intents and purposes, these 2 guilds have been very close competitors for years now, and often are right behind the other. They are very debatably of equal skill level, and the only difference they have are their actual regions they raid in, Echo in the EU and Liquid in NA. Because of this, Liquid actually begins to start their race to world first sooner than Echo can, as release times or raids and patches as a whole are separated across the world. So, if a patch is about to come out in NA gets it on Tuesday, and EU will get it on Wednesday. While this may seem like an unfair advantage, it's just how the time zones of the worlds line up and what Blizzard has to do. There's also a lot of technical advancements Blizzard hasn't yet made to make this a thing, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. In exchange for EU having to play later, they get an exclusive look at the strategies Liquid and others may be using to kickstart a competition against them. They can find out what is good and bad before they even start the progression by watching Liquid perform, and also have less bugs and tuning on bosses. Typically, what happens is NA will reach a boss of Mythic first, then it's too difficult for them, or even on heroic stages, things are bugged and cannot be done. This temporarily halts any NA progression and allows for the EU to jump into it without issue, as it is more than likely already fixed by the time the patch has gone live for them. This is the even trade-off that makes the race a bit more balanced for both sides to an extent. With these things in mind, during Yggdrasil, fans would witness both Liquid and Echo pulling the most insane strategies out to down the bosses, and were almost copying one another to an exact mirror. When both guilds reached Firac, the final boss of Yggdrasil, they had relatively equal progression. Leading up to the final days of the race, both guilds would end their days at a very similar progression to Firac's health. Firac did require nerfs, as many end bosses do when the World First guild approaches them, but they were pushed around the same time both guilds were raiding, so they can both adapt to them together and what to do next. It actually reached a point that both guilds were literally at 1% health on their progression, and any attempt could have been the one that got it at those hours. On top of this, Firac was just genuinely difficult, and it really tested the mentality of both teams to see who could come up with a better strategy and execution in the end. You could have both streams up, and they could coincidentally pull at the same time and literally have killed the boss at the exact same attempt as one another. It was arguably the most fair race to date, and has offered an insanely watchable show for spectators of the event from all around. It gets an entry due to just how close the 2 guilds were and how long they both remained at 1%. There's been some close races in the past, but none so close to the point that both guilds were pulling at the same time and at the exact same percentage. As sometimes what happens is a boss gets a hotfix change to reduce their difficulty while the other team is still asleep because of the time zone changes. A great offender of this being Mythic Raszageth, whose nerf trivialized the fight so much that Echo didn't even realize what had happened when they'd claimed the victory of the Vault of Incarnates previously. And at number 6, we have the mathematically impossible Cthulhu encounter. Back in the original release of Vanilla WoW, Blizzard would release their brand new raid tier, the Temples of Ahn'Qiraj. This temple is the infamous imprisonment of everyone's favorite eyeball old god Cthulhu. Before players were actually allowed to enter the temple itself, however, members of both factions would need to participate in a war effort. This war effort would be a server-specific event that required players to turn in a very large assortment of crafting materials to move a group of NPCs to the gates of the temple everyone is trying to raid. Without this event completed, you could never actually open the gates and not be allowed to raid. Because raiding is the only endgame of Vanilla WoW though, everyone is basically forced to opt into the system and help contribute if they want to try out the new bosses and get the sick new loot. Additionally, at least one player per server must create the Scepter of the Shifting Sands to ring the gong that actually opens the gates once the war effort NPCs have arrived in Silithus. This item is famously known to be the Scarab Lord questline that gets players the title of the same name and one of the only 2 legendary mounts in the entire game, the Black Karaji Battle Tank. The details of this questline are massive, but the general implication is you will need an entire guild support to actually complete the quest to get the scepter in the first place. So each server was bound to at least have someone going for these rewards so they could raid Ahn'Qiraj. Because of all these prerequisites, however, it technically left Cthulhu alive for much longer than almost any other boss in WoW, as he could be killed literally whenever. You just needed the gates to be lowered to zone in. Once you do so, you actually then have to complete the raid and progress to the bosses like you would any other raid tier. This entry though speaks of Cthulhu specifically. Cthulhu would live for 113 total days before finally being brought down by the EU guild Nihilum back in Vanilla. But there's no way the war event and Scepter questline took one of the best raiding guilds of Vanilla this long to complete. The problem with Cthulhu is that despite having the skills and the best gear possibly available to the best guilds raiding him, he just straight up was not possible. Blizzard had accidentally made Cthulhu's numbers far too high for any enabled gamer at the time to achieve and left him in an overpowered state for months. Every single strategy thought of was attempted and nothing could bring him down. It actually was so bad that Ion Hazzikostas, the current game director of WoW, mentioned on a forum post how the fight was mathematically impossible no matter what a guild tried. At the time of this post though, Ion actually didn't work for Blizzard yet. According to his wiki page, Ion had not started working with Blizzard until the summer 2008 when the raid was released in 2006. Ion at the time was a huge fan of WoW and was actually the guildmaster of one of WoW's most renowned guilds called the Elitist Jerks, where he was often seen on forum posts under his shaman Gurgthok talking about the game. Elitist Jerks was one of the top contenders for the best players in all of WoW during Vanilla, and they often were the most popular space to talk about high-end raiding amongst players of WoW during the era. While the guild does still exist to this day, even clearing entire raids on Mythic difficulty still, you cannot find Ion's original character without the aid of the Wayback Machine. You can tell it's his character because of the Scarab Lord title he has and the original Black Karaji mount he possesses. Because of Ion's infamously known posts across WoW and his detailed explanation about the Cthulhu encounter, it has led players to create a rumor that this forum post actually spurred what got Ion the job at Blizzard itself. This is further supported when you realize that when Ion was brought along, he specifically worked on boss encounters and raids and even uses pictures of Cthulhu as his forum posts on Twitter to be identified. This entry, while not all that crazy to how vanilla raids worked back in the day, mostly displays how impossible Cthulhu really was, that it scored players a brand new encounter designer and a game director. No one can actually name a time that the progression of an end boss was so hard that it lived for 113 days before eventually being nerfed. As soon as the impossible numbers were slightly lowered and some of their bugs were fixed, the top guilds almost instantly downed Cthulhu because their strategies they envisioned were correct the entire time. It was just truly the numbers all along. The only other boss that lived longer than Cthulhu was Ragnaros, the very first end boss of a raid in all of WoW. Ragnaros, however, lived so long because WoW was brand new during this existence. Many players were still learning the game and figuring out how to level, which people are more than familiar with taking a very long time. Especially when computers and the internet weren't that great yet to support the high-end raiding we've been accustomed to. So Ragnaros required a large learning curve getting to level 60, getting an able 40 players, and having the necessary DPS to bring him down. Whereas Cthulhu was simply just straight up impossible as players had then learned how the game works and it had the gear to kill him, but still couldn't. And at number 5, we have Sepulchre of the First One's Race. This raid was released as the final tier of Shadowlands and came with it the return of tier sets as a whole. During Shadowlands, players had the ability to craft a legendary specific to their class and specialization. These would increase your character's power greatly, similar to the legendaries of Legion. Covenants would also be introduced and would grant you power that is specific to your class and specialization, and during Sepulchre, you were able to swap freely between them, so they tuned the bosses with this in mind. Additionally, players were given a second legendary item this patch, which could enhance your already existing Covenant ability even further to increase your character's throughput. So you had 2 legendary tier sets, a Covenant ability, and just generally stronger gear as you progressed a raid like usual. With all of these combined, your character would do exceptionally higher DPS than the previous tier, Sanctum of Domination. So in order to properly tune the raid, Blizzard took all of these variables into account. Now, because Blizzard assumed players would be doing ridiculous amounts of damage and healing, they tuned the dial and the difficulty of the bosses within Sepulchre raid up to 13. Not the 11th dial, but 13 in most people's opinions, as Sepulchre is dated to be one of the hardest raids in WoW's entire existence. It was certainly the most nerfed raid of all time as well, which will be discussed a bit more heavily later. To avoid another Emerald Nightmare situation where the raid is too easy, Blizzard instead created a challenge that tested the absolute mettle of their best players in the world. In the current Race the World First understanding, this race is actually the second longest there is after Mythic difficulty was introduced in WoW, as it took 18 days to defeat the Jailer, and the first place boss was Kil'jaeden from Tomb of Sargeras at 19 days. More uniquely, Blizzard also designed this raid to have 2 bosses designed like end bosses, with the obvious one being the Jailer and the other being Anduin Wrynn. Anduin in his own right would have been the end to a great raid based on how he was made, and was actually harder than the bosses ahead of him, besides the Jailer, because the Jailer had his own secret phase while Anduin did not. Because of this design choice, the race came to a grinding stall, and watching it became similar to how you'd watch an end boss now. It also must be mentioned that before Anduin was another absolutely insane wall of a boss, and arguably one of the best fights created by Blizzard, Halondrus. This boss, despite being only an end wing boss, took over 357 attempts before being felled. This surpasses Blackhand Mythic and close seconds Jaina and Queen Azshara, who are all end bosses of their own raids, ranking Halondrus among one of the highest wipe counts in recorded history. It literally jumped from one wall boss to the next, and it would extend the length of the race greatly. It's quite rare for a race to reach the 2-week mark nowadays since this event, as the Sepulchre of the first one's race took nearly 3 whole weeks to complete. Could you imagine raiding for 12 hours each day for 18 days straight? It sounds torturous to even the most diehard fans of WoW, and clearly showed its strain on the players of Liquid, who were very close to claiming the win on the Jailer. During the race, the team of Liquid was so burnt out, they made the executive call to retire earlier from the raid and go home to recharge and try again a few days later. This was a huge moment for the race, as it solidifies the fact that this raid was so genuinely difficult and hard on the mental that it was actually safer to just stop playing altogether to avoid harming themselves physically. While it may not seem difficult, the task eventually became menial and your mind is just absolutely fried, and trying to go further is like making a dead rat spin a wheel. It eventually just felt like this for all of the competition and made them look like unpaid beta testers for the fights provided. This is mostly because of the insane amount of nerfs given to the bosses, as even after the kills, it almost felt like every single week after, there was a nerf to some boss and some difficulty from the raid. Basically, Blizzard completely overshot the scaling of this raid, and because of it, they ensured that many future tiers would not be like Sepulchre, and they won't continue the idea of 2 end bosses going forward. It was a good time for experiments, but for the Race the World First raiders, it certainly was a negative experience. And at number 4, we have the US wins in Heart of Fear at Ny'alotha. When a new raid tier is released, Blizzard follows the standard protocol mentioned for the entry 7. NA will get to the raids first and EU a day later because of time zones. While many might think this is advantageous to NA, history shows this never was actually the case. Many NA guilds rarely claimed a world first kill of an end boss, and it was rather the EU that won most of them. In between Vanilla and Mists of Pandaria, the last recorded world first kill by a US team was Drama killing Nefarian in Blackwing Lair in 2005. It wasn't until Mists of Pandaria's Heart of Fear raid in 2012 that any NA team had claimed a world first raid, 7 whole years since the region's last win. The Empress Shak'Zir kill was landed by the Guild Blood Legion. This is also the expansion the team method truly began to rise and started to make a name for themselves. This was even seen most popularly on the Shaw of Fear kill in Entry 8. From here on, Method would go on to absolutely dominate the competition of World First and claim many titles for their own, only occasionally losing to other EU teams such as Exorcist from the Nighthold tier. They had arguably cheated the system, as any player wishing to compete at this level only wanted to be part of their guild. so contenders in the top 10 guilds would eventually just flock directly to them and feed Method even more greatly skilled players, furthering their reign upon many tiers. This was until the raid on Ny'alotha, where a close competitor from the US had made their names known and devised a wholly new strategy to make themselves known. This team, of course, would be Liquid, now known as Liquid, with the creation of the 21st Man strategy. In Mythic raiding, the scaling is default set to 20 players, nothing more and nothing less. What often happened was the raid leader would then need to be present in the raid to accurately tell their players what to do and devise strategies. What the 21st Man would do, however, is simply spectate their raiders rather than play the game itself. They could focus entirely on shot calling and keeping their team focused, rather than feeling the pressure of having to execute mechanics at the same time as their rotation. It was so effective that it's still used to this day by the top guilds in Race to the World First. With the 21st Man, Limit would go on to claim the first NA win on February 6, 2020, 8 years since the previous NA victory with the Heart of Fear. With this victory, it completely centered the attention of Limit and captured them as true contenders of the race, and helped create the entertainment we know today when Blizzard creates a brand new raid. If it weren't for these wins, we may have never really seen the return of NA. And we could still have an environment where the race is generally already decided by the time they announce the next tier, because one team has all the members they need, placing it at number 4. And at number 3, we have Peace's victory within the Crucible of Storms. Every so often, Blizzard creates a sort of mini-raid that typically only has up to 3 bosses within the instance. They generally aren't super difficult to overcome compared to real raid tiers, so they aren't always taken very seriously. However, in the case of Crucible of Storms, not only does the guild Pieces break a long winning streak of Method, but they took down arguably one of the toughest bosses in all of WoW, clocking the highest wipe count in the entire game in the process. Essentially what happened was, when this raid was released, the previous raid tier, Battle for Dazar'alor, was already completed. To ease the content drought, Crucible of Storms was made, but tuned around the idea that people entering it would already be maxed out because of BOD's raid, and have little to no issues. It also didn't have the craziest loot inside, so not many people were jumping the gun to get what was inside Crucible super desperately, as it was barely better than what BOD provided. So Blizzard made the mistake of making yet another raid too difficult for the amount of power players actually possessed on their characters. At the same time, current reigning champions Method had thought the raid was going to be part of the more casual nature and didn't commit as many days and hours to the raid as they initially planned. So their scheduling members as a whole were very scattered when the race was happening, and it was difficult to keep the same people all at once. Now, what made Unox so hard for even the best players was the mechanic Unstable Resonance. This mechanic marks a chunk of the raid and forces players to run to someone of the same mark to remove it. If you run into someone of the opposite mark, you would most certainly one-shot everyone around you, resulting in a wipe. Before, the Resonance debuff just used to instantly kill you if you ran into the incorrect mark, meaning you had to be spread from your raid almost at all times to avoid getting the debuff and killing someone the moment it did. On April 26, 2019, Unstable Resonance was made to have a short delay before it would trigger its explosion, allowing for more ample time of stacking. Blizzard would implement strategies to allow players to more easily find their partners for this mechanic in April 29, 2019, with less Oblivion tier casts, less frequently inconvenient timings of Eyes in N'Zoth, and an increase of the debuff duration from 12 to 15 seconds. When it came to the Eyes in N'Zoth, it would send large beams across the arena that must be dodged very carefully. Very commonly, this would be cast at the same time as Unstable Resonance, so not only do you need to avoid the beams, you would need to be very careful about who is around you to not one-shot them. You can see in many guide videos that guilds would stack as many warlocks as possible to use a demonic circle teleport ability to just completely skip the mechanic. After this, guilds finally were able to start reaching phase 3 of the encounter, and refining their methods to kill the old god minion. But because all the hardest mechanics occurred in phase 1 of the fight, many of the wipes that were counted were in the first few minutes of the encounter, as almost no one could progress beyond it. Essentially what marks this raid as so important in the Race to the World First history is that ever since this raid, Blizzard has never made a mini raid since then. It was likely because of the 731 total wipes Pieces had before they actually killed the boss, and Blizzard would just rather not compile resources, something a majority of players aren't going to interact with. So, even though Blizzard was creating mini-raids in the past, like Ruby Sanctum, Eye of Eternity, and others, they've decided to move away from this genre altogether since the insane catastrophe that was the Crucible of Storms. And at number 2, we have Method nearly disbanding entirely. As mentioned in previous entries, players have grown accustomed to the name Method and their very numerous titles across the many WoW tiers. They heralded styles of raiding that players see today, and many people continue to make use of their special add-ons, like the Method Dungeon Tools, which is now Mythic Dungeon Tools and Method Raid Tools. The reason for the name change, however, comes with a good reason. To sum things up, one of their star players who had the biggest presence on Twitch was accused of some pretty serious crime. When the claims of this crime started to look more credible over time, the internet lambasted Method for keeping the player on the roster for so long, and many accused them of trying to hide the crime. Because of this terrible event, all of Method's sponsors, many of its players, and media outlets completely ceased working with them altogether and quit the organization. It also must be mentioned that during this event there was no actual Race to World First happening, and rather took place between Ny'alotha and Castle Nathria. The reason this is important is because in the wake of players disgusted by the behavior shown by their previous guild, they created a new one of their own called Echo. Echo would become the new Method essentially, and to brand themselves entirely apart from Method, aside from some of its members being ex-players of the other guild. For all intents and purposes, this is the correct decision to make, but it stands out because it helps create the Race to World First we know of today. Without Echo and Liquid, we wouldn't have incredibly close races like we did in Idrisil ever again, and the enjoyment of WoW's peak esport-like event is completely gone. Even in the wake of the event, Method has managed to rebuild their brand and gain the trust of the WoW community once again, often even getting third place in the Race to World First and tailing the second guild competition rather closely. So it's nice to see the community of WoW unite under a common banner and enjoy the event for what it is, outside of the actions of a complete weirdo. And completing our list at number 1 is the Serenite bomb strat using Icecrown Citadel. Back in ICC from Wrath of the Lich King encounter had an intermission phase mechanic that would destroy portions of the arena to limit the space players had to defeat him. These platforms would naturally rebuild for each intermission when Arthas runs to the center of the platform to cast Remorseless Winter and start the intermission itself. The broken parts of the stage are very important, as during phase 2 of the fight, the Lich King would summon Valkyrie adds to its side. These Valkyries would grab players and attempt to carry them off the edge of the platform and drop them to their deaths, and the only way to stop this was with heavy crowd control abilities, like Chains of Ice and high DPS. However, very strangely during the progression of ICC during the first few weeks, players of the guild Insidia learned that using Serenite bombs would actually rebuild the platforms early. So instead of the Valkyries dropping you to your death, they would just temporarily pick you up and no one had to help you and you can continue hitting the boss for damage. Insidia at this time was actually a combination of two different guilds, Nihilum and SK Gaming, who are both based in the EU. During the era of Wrath, they were considered to be some of the best guilds in the entire game, and when they combined forces to create Insidia, they absolutely smashed raid tiers ahead of them. It's like if Echo and Liquid combined teams right now to give a better comparison. With this new Insidia team, the players would go into Icecrown Citadel fully prepared to give their shot at the world first kill, the 25-man heroic Lich King. Though, perhaps shockingly or not, the people who participated in their first normal Lich King kill were all given a 3-day ban for the usage of Serenite bombs to rebuild the platforms surrounding them. Members of Insidia claimed they had no idea what was rebuilding the platforms and were only performing their rotations as normal, which can be pretty believable. These Serenite bombs were an integral part to many players for an extra 1% damage increase to bring these bosses down, and were used in many tiers previously to help kill a boss that much faster. In the case of Lich King, this was no different. So it was strange to see they got banned, and it was super unclear if they actually purposefully cheated or not. Many have speculated the event, but truly only the members of Insidia know what happened and have said many times on streams that it was just during a normal raid and obviously they were not cheating. But because of the ban that occurred, it became almost impossible for their players to make a comeback in the race against the Lich King on Heroic, and many lost their motivation in the process. There have even been reports of players on the Terran Mill server, the server they played on back in the day, intentionally trying to crash the server so they couldn't raid ICC. The best way to summarize this event is using the previous metaphor. It's like if Echo and Liquid combined to make a team, cheated to kill a boss on normal mode, got banned, and then nearly disbanded their newly founded guild in the process while being sabotaged by players of their server. It sounds hilarious in theory and set in stone a version of WoW we experience today as raiders of any level. Blizzard has a zero tolerance policy for cheating on raid encounters, and even mentioned numerous times they could just teleport into your raid instance on a GM character and watch you while invisible. Because of this cheating, there have been instances where guilds like Liquid and Echo are now in direct contact with Blizzard as they progress beyond bosses during the race, often asking if certain strategies are okay in the first place before performing them because it could be viewed as an unintended method to down a boss. It was such a huge deal back in the days of Wrath, and ex-players of the guild, like Coogan TV, continue to say they did not cheat and were robbed of their opportunity to participate in the Race to World First, as they didn't actually claim a single World First kill of any of the ICC bosses due to their ban and lost motivation. Alright, and that finishes off the list. If there's anything you think we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know in the comments.